Hi, I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening to the Weekly Wake Up and welcome to our weekly studio show that sets the alarm off on what's really happening in our country and what we can do about it. Like, for instance, the makers of Grand Theft Auto video game appear guilty of grand theft themselves, given that they've not paid corporation tax for 10 years while claiming 42 million in tax relief. And how the cuts in working pension budgets have contributed to 4 million people in deep poverty. We're also going to be talking about inequality and not being able to buy a home and how difficult that is. Now, the Weekly Wake Up is part of the Real Agenda network of podcasts for political change. And for the second week running, it's an all-boys team. What have we done? Well, to be fair, we're a team of volunteers and sometimes work commitments get in the way. So we expect Satya and Leah to be back next week. And also, we're looking for new people on the team. So whether you'd like to help on content production or marketing, contact us now. So in addition to myself today, we've also got on the team
Oliver.
Hi, Oliver. How you doing?
I'm very good, Tom.
So what have you been up to this week?
Oh, working hard, slugging my guts out.
Well, that's very good. So life in the city, all right?
It's good.
Okay, so what topic are you going to talk about today?
So, Tom, I'm going to talk today about a recent report that came out by the Social Metrics Commission, where they're basically a group of experts from across the political spectrum, where they said that 4.5 million people live on incomes less than half the poverty line, which sets about 6% of the UK's average annual income of £28,000. And I guess why I want to mention that is really in relation to, I guess, our new Prime Minister, who has, in his speech on the steps of Downing Street, said that he wants to answer the plea of the forgotten people and the left behind and just address what he's going to do about that.
Thanks, Oliver. Okay, Eddie. Now, welcome. Eddie, co-host of the show. Thanks for joining us last week. And Eddie has been so good, he's come back this week. Eddie, you've got a topic very important. Tell us about it.
I do. So this week, Santander carried out the largest ever survey of potential first-time buyers in the UK. Over 70% of potential first-time buyers don't see themselves being able to buy a house in their lifetime. So I'm interested in this, and then also the ramifications this has for inequality and how it can perpetuate the ways that house ownership can lead to inequality in our society.
Okay, well, we're talking about that a bit more in a moment. And the other story today, which I just briefly mentioned, was this fact that people are getting away with not paying corporation tax when it looks like some should be due, pointing particularly at the makers of Grand Theft Auto video game. It's the name Grand Theft, really, isn't it? But it's and apparently it is a USA term, but it's and apparently it means a property over $950. That's a grand theft. Anything below is not such a grand theft. Oliver, kick us off. You just started talking about that. Tell us a bit more about that subject, and we'll chip in and see what we think.
Yeah. So this, I guess, topic based on a report from the Social Metrics Commission, saying that there's 4.5 million people who live on incomes less than half the poverty line, to me is quite a shocking figure. And for me, it comes at a time actually when, I guess, this July sort of marks the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference. One of their development goals or moral obligations, quote, to help all humans achieve a standard of living sufficient to live fulfilling lives. And in the context of our new Prime Minister's pledge to sort of help sort of the forgotten people on the steps of Downing Street, he's got a mountain to climb, is the point I'm trying to make. And I think for us as the Real Agenda, really want to highlight some of the issues that could be quick wins for the Premier. I know he's said that he's going to sort of throw more money at sort of knife crime and violence, which can help in terms of social equality, but there's other issues that need to be addressed as well.
It certainly is, and I think one of the things there is that from that particular report, we touched on some of it previously, but this information just came out. Not only does that include 2.3 million children who are in deep poverty, but it's also the fact that what the Commission is saying is that it showed that austerity had undermined 2 decades of anti-poverty policy, effectively by cutting 40 billion a year from our work and pensions budget through cuts and freezes on tax credits. Why have we got more in this awful situation? Because we've been cutting budgets that have supported and helped these people. It staggers me that this isn't the number one priority, really. I don't know. What do you think, Eddie?
I mean, it's sort of what we touched on last week about Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister and appointing his cabinet, and that coming at a time where these inequality stats don't appear to be waning in any way, shape or form. Oliver, you mentioned the lip service Boris Johnson paid to solving inequality, but until we see that enactioned in any policy, I don't think there is any reason to feel hopeful about those stats eventually waning.
I find it incredible. And the Commission also mentions that disability is one of the strongest predicators of being in poverty. Nearly half of those living below the breadline live in a household where someone is disabled. And also the fact that work is no longer a guarantee of protection against poverty. At the millennium, 54% of children lived in a family where an adult worked. So what are we going to do about it?
Yes, for me, this all comes at a time when globalization and I guess what it purports to be is falling apart, and it does require a radical change by the people in power. But are they prepared to do that, such as raising taxes where it needs to be raised, be it corporation tax, raising personal tax for sort of certain high earners, sort of more state intervention but not overburdening, I guess, with bureaucracy? These are stuff, to me, some of the sort of things that can be and should be done.
This piece that I read about this, it says a government spokesman said tackling poverty has always been a priority for this government. Now, I would like to think so. And, we do know someone that talked about the burning injustices 3 years ago, whenever it was, and saw nothing done. We've now got someone else talking about some of these things. Anyway, the government spokesman went on to say, we want to build on our progress to ensure every family can thrive. That's why we raised the personal allowance to take 1.74 million out of the lowest paid out of income tax. Well, the crazy thing about that is, income tax starts at 11,500 and that's not enough to live off. So why are we taking income taxes off these people in the first place? So the perception is that, they are doing something, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
Sorry, I think one thing that I think is worth noting is that something this government has pointed to as an economic success and a signal that equality will come to an end has been employment figures, that employment hasn't been a massive issue under this government and we have been able to keep relatively low levels of unemployment. And I think that points to the idea that there are two problems. That firstly, that people's spending power is limited. Even if they do have a job and a wage, the cost of living is now so high for certain people, especially in cities like London, but also elsewhere in the country, that the cost of living is so high that a certain standard of life becomes unaffordable. But also, as you were alluding to there, that taxed income can be so high that it also makes it hard for people to reach out of poverty.
It just always seems to me so crazy. Why take money off people that don't have it in the first place? The government spokesman said, and they increased the national living wage to provide the biggest pay rise for low-paid workers in 20 years. Now, that really annoys me because they called it a living wage, and it is not. Now, the real living wage, which is the one set by the Living Wage Foundation, which, interestingly enough, was actually originally started by the Reverend Paul Nicholson, our friend from Taxpayers Against Poverty, who did the initial work on a real living wage or minimum income standards, which then became the Living Wage Foundation. The real living wage is not the same as the national living wage, and the national living wage is not based on what you need to live off. Living Wage Foundation's figures are based on what you need to live off. So this is pure marketing from George Osborne, who's put it forward a slight increase in the national minimum wage. And that's still not enough. I mean, it's just not enough to live off. And so to say we've increased it, to me, doesn't work. We've got to do a lot more to raise the minimum wage.
One thing I am encouraged by from this new government is the new Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson. He's pledged to focus a lot on funding for sort of education right from nursery through to further education. And for me, that is one of the keys to solving inequality and alleviating poverty. And if they're serious about that and they are genuine about it, I think that's a really good thing as such. And Boris is behind that. And I know Gavin Williamson has some success in getting extra funding for the defence industry. So maybe he might have similar success for the education sector as well.
We certainly hope so. These things need to be sorted. 14 million people in poverty is an embarrassment. Well, that's not the key point. It's embarrassing. It's actually the 14 million people in poverty who have to suffer every day, and we're not sorting it out. There was the other point was mentioned by one of the Commission members, Helen Barnard, who's from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We need our new Prime Minister to get to work immediately on a bold plan to boost living standards and support our towns and cities in building a more hopeful economic future. We need specifics on that, don't we? That's one thing that needs to be further reiteration of the problems that we need to get sorted.
High on the PM's agenda.
Eddie, introduce your topic.
So my topic is this week, Santander, the Spanish bank and mortgage lender, conducted the largest ever survey of first-time buyers. And the results, I think, are quite notable and scary for anyone of my generation. So it found that from people aged between 18 and 34...
So your generation is...
Millennial, I guess,
Millennial,
would be
okay.
the official term.
Yeah.
I don't know where we lie with Gen X or Gen Z. I think millennial.
Okay, we'll let
1995 I was born.
We'll get you the T-shirt. We've got quite a representative age group here, but we won't go the ones that are older than that. Some of us are a bit older than that.
So the Santander survey found that 70% of young people now believe that the home ownership dream is over for millennials and that it's going to become an impossibility. I think this is interesting for a number of reasons. Obviously, because I think that's a stark stat in just that is self-reflective, that 70% of young people feel they won't ever own a home. But also, I think one thing that you have to take into account and remember is that a lot of people are going to own homes, and those are going to be the people who inherit homes from their parents. And so this is just going to perpetuate a cycle of inequality and a cycle of social mobility being harder and harder, because essentially what puts you at the best footing is not your merit, not how hard you work, not the career you have, but the success of those above you. And especially for cities like London, which are becoming gentrified so quickly, you know, there are people who own homes that they would have bought for much, much less than they'll be able to sell them for now. And it's incredibly fortunate for those children, and I can understand why they'd be happy. But if you're not in that situation and you're outside London, the gap between you and those people is only going to grow. I think this is something that we need to be aware of. And also the things that branch off home ownership. So how early people feel comfortable starting a family, how early people feel comfortable retiring. These are all things that can be affected by home ownership. And if we now have a generation of people who can't afford homes, all those things are going to be different for them.
And it's also, it's other unintended consequences, isn't it? People have got to pay off student loans. Yep. And so that affects your decisions to purchase things, because you know you've got to take into account that student loan. You know, whereas my generation, you know, got student grants. Yep. And although admittedly, personally, I didn't get the full student grant. You know, so you didn't leave university. Some people did leave with debts. But now you've got to take into account, you've got to pay it off.
Yep, absolutely. Student debt is a huge factor. I think
so it's dampening down demand as well. That's, you know.
I mean, yeah, exactly. That's the point I was going to make. Is I think it's easy to suggest that, you know, this is an issue with millennials' ability to budget, or consumerism has gone out of control, so people are spending too much money in other areas. And there might be nuggets of truth to those suggestions, but I think what you're going to find is people who can afford to buy houses, you know, what effect does that have on their quality of life outside of their home ownership? You know, what kind of sacrifices will people have to make, and what effect will that have on their happiness and their prosperity?
Oliver, you mentioned something about stopping buying lattes. I know you didn't say this, but you made a reference to some point.
Well, no, I have a couple of points on this, and I have a couple of strong views on this, I guess, as well. But one thing I actually want to mention, I'll give a plug to my friend's book here, actually, because he actually wrote a book about how it's called How to Murder Your Mortgage in 7 Years. And he's got a family, two daughters are about 10, 12 years old from memory. And I read his book, didn't agree with much with what was in it, and he was very, let's say, frugal with his finances. But I guess the point he made, and I think I would sort of back up, is that there's a lot of things people can cut back on, and they can be very creative with the little they have. And actually, as a marketing person, whenever there's a recession, this is an analogy actually, whenever there's a recession on, marketing is often one of the first things to get cut. What you find when you're with limited resources, you're much more resourceful with the limited resources that you have with what you can do. And I think the same analogy can to a certain extent be applied to people who are looking to buy houses. And funny enough, I was talking to a colleague at work this week, a millennial who you've met, Tom, I won't mention her name on air. We were talking about this particular topic, and she was saying, if she cut down a lot of her holidays, she probably could have a deposit for a property. That might have been a flip of remark. I was a bit shocked at that.
That's sort of the inequality that I think I'm talking about, because so if she cuts down her holidays, maybe she will be able to afford some property. But if her parents owned property in London, well, then she doesn't have to cut down on her holiday. So there's the inequality between the.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are two parts. I think there's definitely inequality in the people who are able to easily pass on their property to their kids if they've got property. It doesn't have to be in London, actually. It actually can just be property anywhere in any part of the country. The fact is that they have property. But in the city, London, where I guess 9 out of 10, they may not have properties to pass on, that's where the inequality becomes more acute. And that's where I guess the government needs to focus on. Because when I look at I see walking around London, so much development of properties, but they all look very high-end and unaffordable. So one, they're not going to probably for millennials who can afford it, or to sort of keep workers who can afford the properties. So where is the justice in that?
We also know how many properties in London are being left vacant, the effect that foreign investment's having on those. And these are often high-end properties, but it trickles down because the people who can't afford that, the people who could afford those but now can't, go for the next rung, and it goes on and on and on. And then there's millennials at the bottom who now can't afford a property. So I think something that does need to be addressed is kind of this concept we have as property as an investment, and if that's sustainable.
Yeah, I think so. Just to add to that, actually, I think working in the industry that I work in, actually, a lot of investment managers actually were looking at something called private rental sector, which is actually quite a growing industry. But what they saw in some research that was done was that there's a cultural shift amongst millennials in terms of owning the property. And I'm not sure what's come first, whether they've decided they don't want to own property because they can't afford it, or they can't afford it and not owning property. But there is certain, in the research that I've read, there is a shift in that respect, similar to, I guess, in continental Europe.
There's a sociological angle to take on it as well, which is, if you read these articles that have come after the Santander study, a lot of them are referring to couples being able to afford houses. So they assume two people with £30,000 wages will be able to get a mortgage of however much. Well, the case is, in generations past, a lot of people would buy houses on their own. That's not going to be as easy anymore. So is there more pressure to kind of couple up so you can afford a house? Do we also live in a scenario where there's massive inequality between couples are at a huge advantage? Are roommates going to become roommates of people in their older years? Is that going to become a much more regular thing? I think that's something that, and there's stigmas in those areas that we have to deal with. And I think it's going to challenge a lot of the kind of family unit and the way that we live now.
You mentioned the private rental market, because the problem there is we've got not enough social housing, and the problem with areas like, an example is Tottenham in London, where once again the organisation Taxpayers Against Poverty have been doing a lot of casework and campaigning. Low-income employed homeless families with a little too much income for housing benefit can get in a situation where they're being forced to move from council rents of, say, £90 a week to private rent, which is £300 a week. So because there's not enough council houses, they're being forced out, if they're in temporary accommodation, and therefore they're having to pay more for, I'm going to say the same thing, but, for accommodation. And a lot of this accommodation is not of a good quality. So there's that end of the market as well. But I think the point you make about, if you like, the up-and-coming millennial generation, it's not only is it buying houses, which we are, focused on here in the UK compared to continental partners, and I will say our continental partners, actually, but our continental neighbours. But it's also, therefore, that's the rentals then that are high. So it's even more difficult to rent a decent property for the millennial generation, because the rents are so high, because the land is so expensive, because of the private speculation. So there are things that can be done on all these fronts, how we treat land, whose ownership of land, how it's taxed, and so on. So there are answers that could be made to that. Anybody got anything to add on that one?
I just want to add this final point that actually just mentioning about social economic consequences. One thing I have noticed actually is a lot of areas get gentrified. A lot of indigenous population are almost forced out of those areas. And I have to sort of point out there's like Hackney, Brixton, and even parts of where I live actually. And I know there was a report in the paper sort of a few months ago about it's creating a lot of sort of hostility between people who are moving in and creating, I guess, their own enclaves over the area against indigenous population. And I think you do need to preserve some of those people who actually built up those areas. Which
communities are being broken up, and disruption in schooling once you've got family to be moved around, because they're redeveloping areas, and it doesn't seem to be taking.
I think like with anything, it's like with capitalism itself, which went too far with the housing situation. It's about a balance. The money coming in does help, but then how far do you go? Do you, pushing people out? If you bring money in and bring people with you that are from that community, then that's a good thing. But if you're doing it at such an extreme that you're forcing a whole community out that actually built up that area, then that's not good.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think also, if there's one thing that the 21st century displayed is that not everyone should be given a mortgage, and that can lead to dire consequences. It's about finding a healthy medium. When money is lent too easily, we saw a lot of the ramifications of that in the financial crisis. So I'm not an advocate of that in any way, shape or form, but I just think this is clearly an impactful study that tells us at least something about how the housing market and standard of life is going to look in the future.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that, Eddie. And we know there are things that can be done on this, but it just does not seem to be a priority, and it must be a priority to provide. It's the number one human need, but food, then shelter and home. And, that's not just somewhere to live, it's a home, to make something into a home. And we'll finish off with just something that's been quite well reported about the makers of the Grand Theft Auto video game, who paid no corporation tax for 10 years. And yet the company, which is Edinburgh-based developer of Grand Theft Auto, they're called Rockstar North, has paid no corporation tax for 10 years, despite making billions in revenue for its parent company, Take-Two Interactive. And it's been claiming, it claimed 42 million in tax relief. Now, this report was from the investigative think tank Tax Watch UK, and they estimate that the operating profit over the 10 years has been like £4 billion. That's for the group. And so therefore, it does seem something a bit strange. They're a very successful company in terms of sales, but they're making no contribution for the wealth, a lot of the wealth that has been created in this country. So what do we think about that then, team?
It's actually, my mind gets drawn to one thing when I hear this story. I remember under George Osborne's time as Chancellor, I remember there was I can't pinpoint exactly where the speech was, but there was definitely a time and place, and probably multiple times, when he celebrated the British gaming industry as an example of Britain exporting great goods around the world. Might not have mentioned Rockstar Games because they are quite controversial. They make adult games, to say the least. Just looking back at that speech now, you think, but what's the point if they're not paying corporation tax? Like, why are we celebrating? Like, what's the point of celebrating companies like this if they're not? If all that they can offer is, people's entertainment, but they're not paying their fair share, I think it's really upsetting.
Well, they're just paying the income, paying for the people that work for them, but there's a huge wealth being created here that's either going overseas or going nowhere. In fact, it's being extracted by. So to qualify for tax relief scheme, the games under development must pass a cultural test administered by the British Film Institute that establishes a significant contribution to British culture. Now, to qualify, games must score at least 16 out of 31 points attributed to British settings, characters and development, and promoting cultural diversity. This seems very strange that they should qualify because Grand Theft Auto, though produced in Britain, is actually set in California. It's quite clear that that's what it is, and it's used in American terms like Grand Theft. And so I can't understand why it would qualify for British cultural. So I've got no clue on that.
According to what I'm reading here, Tom, it says the series pays homage to the British crime films of the 1960s and 70s, including Get Carter.
I think that's a bit of a stretch. That's a slight stretch.
Exactly. I don't know where they stretch that from.
No, exactly.
A cameo appearance of Michael Caine somewhere in the background.
I guess that's when they apply for their funding. They need to get that funding, I guess.
It's good to support companies in their early stages, but we're now talking about a company that's got us well established.
Absolutely.
And, what does it mean that this is happening here? Well, one, the profits is going to somewhere where it wasn't created. And it means there's a lot of money that could pay for public services there's the number one priority, the 14 million people in poverty.
So I guess they're not actually creating any jobs onshore as well, are they? Do we know if they're actually creating any
jobs here?
Yeah.
In the UK? I don't know about creating, but I presume, and I haven't checked it, that actually are employing people here. I know apparently the founders have moved to the US.
Well, yeah, they've moved to New York now.
So anyway, George Turner, the director of Tax Watch, went on to say how outrageous that the UK taxpayers being asked to shell out tens of millions of pounds to subsidise the developers of Grand Theft Auto, given that at the time the game's developers put their tax credit application, Grand Theft Auto was already generating several $1 billion in sales and profits. This is the worst drive-by assault on the British taxpayer and corporate welfare, scrounging at its very worst.
According to the government spokesperson, claims for tax relief were carefully scrutinised. See, this is for me again. This is where I'm not a believer in heavy government intervention, but I think where excesses are clearly being played out, that's where regulation or government do intervene to get a balance. Yes, you want thriving development, good companies, but then if they're doing this sort of thing and they're not being responsible about it and then ploughing back into the country, which has helped them, then they should be penalised, but they should be brought to account.
Okay, well, thanks very much. That's about the show for this week. If you've got any comments, do contact us on info@realagenda.org. We hope we've woken you up. You've not fallen asleep while you've been listening to this, but we're hoping you've woken up to what's really happening here and that we've helped in some way to inspire you into action. You can find out more on our website, realagenda.org. And coming up on the Real Agenda very soon is all about human rights. We're talking to Francesca Klug, OBE, and we're going to be talking particularly about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and why it's so important and how universal is the key word there. And we've got several other exciting things also in the pipeline. But that's it for this week. Special thanks to our sponsors, Reverse Media Group, one of the fastest growing search and media companies. Find out why at reversemediagroup.com. Now, one thing is certain, people want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for the people over party. It's urgent, and it's up to us to make it happen. That's the Real Agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thanks for listening.
I'm Oliver.
And
Oliver.
You're Oliver, are you? Okay.
Thank you, Billy.
And say goodbye.
Yes, bye, Tom.
Don't say goodbye to me. Say goodbye to everybody else. Okay, and also we've got here
Eddie. It's goodbye from me.
Thank you very much for your contributions here in the studio, and I hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be talking to you again soon.